Oh. Well, here we are with the assistant metro editor for the Decatur Daily with Franklin Harris. And we are going to start talking about libertarianism and pop culture. If how do you think that is important libertarianism in the relationship between libertarianism and popular culture, and I think that sometimes it's not much talk, because I am from Peru, and here I mean there are some relatively well-known libertarians, Mario Vargas Llosa, and but they, I mean, they're Vargas Llosa is a very formal kind of writer, and he's very much against counterculture, and well, Hernandez Soto basically mainly talks about economics and nothing else, and it's quite sad. I think it's, but when one think about libertarianism, one finds things like Robert Anton Wilson and The Moon is a Harsh Mistress by Robin Heinlein and things like that. And how you think that there is this relation?
Well, I think that when it comes to politics, culture is always primary to politics. And I think that's something that we've seen in America in just the last several years. I think the strides, for example, that the gay rights movement has made has been primarily a cultural one, and the politics followed. The popular culture made mainstream gay life, gay characters, with shows like Will and Grace on NBC and others. And when people saw gay characters just going about being ordinary people in their TV shows and in their movies, I think that's one thing that helped move forward the gay rights movement and made things like the recent gay marriage ruling both possible and made it where it was more accepted by the broader political culture than perhaps it would have been otherwise. Now, as far as libertarianism in popular culture, I mean, you're dealing with a rather small group of people who are out and out libertarians, who are cultural figures as opposed to political figures or economic figures or whatnot. I mean, you have Ayn Rand, who comes to mind immediately, who, while she would have distanced herself from the libertarian movement, is part of that broader constellation, politically, culturally speaking. And lots of people who've become interested in libertarian ideas come through the channel of Ayn Rand. I know that for me it was discovering Ayn Rand in high school, which is what it is for so many people, especially of my age. It's probably less common now than it used to be, but that used to be pretty common. Apart from that, I mean, you've got, Drew Carey, who's now out, as a libertarian, and he's campaigning for Gary Johnson. You've got people like Kurt Russell, who's have said in the past, I'm a libertarian, and I guess you would call me a libertarian. Is what they typically say. They'll hem and haw. But I really do think that culture is primary to politics, and if libertarianism really hopes to make an impact large through the culture, or make a political impact, it has to make a cultural impact first. And people like things like the novels of Robert Heinlein are certainly, that's one thing. The Moon is a Harsh Mistress is a favorite of mine. But it also helps to sort of get out of the ghettos of genre, if you will, because Heinlein is pigeonholed. Well, he's a science fiction writer. Ayn Rand, I've always kind of gone back and forth in my evaluation of her, and I finally decided I really liked her once I discovered, well, she's just a pulp writer who writes these very pulp 30s, 40s type stories, but her chosen method is the Russian epic novel. So she has the form of Tolstoy in which to tell stories that she would have found in the pulp magazines that she would have seen when she first came to America early in the 20th century. And I think, if libertarians really want to make a difference, it certainly helps to do so through the culture. I think one of the most influential libertarians of the last several years has probably been Ron Swanson, the libertarian character on the sitcom Parks and Recreation.
Yes.
And Ron Swanson is a character even non-libertarians love. I mean, yeah, they may sort of roll their eyes at him when he says something, but when he gives that great speech to the girl that's there for career day, and he's describing what government is, and he picks up half her sandwich and eats it. This is what government does. It's suckling at your chaps. That's I think some of the groundwork that has to be laid. I mean, otherwise you wind up getting ahead of ourselves a little bit. How do you move the needle politically if you don't have the cultural groundwork there, because they just think you're a weirdo? I mean, yes, the Libertarian Party could have nominated a real hardcore libertarian. Everyone would have just thought he was a weirdo, and they would be polling less than Gary Johnson is, because the foundation's not there. Gary Johnson can go out there as kind of a moderate and maybe tilt the needle a little bit because he portrays himself as a moderate, reasonable person first. That's what he's going for. His gaffes don't help with that. But that's what he's going for, rather than the hardcore banging away libertarian message. And I know that's gotten some people in the movement and in the party upset,
Yes.
but you've kind of got to decide, what's the party for? Is the Libertarian Party for that? Well, expect to get 1% of the vote, maybe, if you're lucky. If you're for kind of sort of bending the curve, Gary Johnson's probably the candidate you want. You just don't want him to ask what's Aleppo and the like. So
Yes, that's true.
so I don't like referring to it as the culture war or anything that kind of overstates it. But
Yes.
if you really care about these sorts of things, the culture is where you're going to have to start. The culture is primary, and a lot of conservatives right now are finding that out because they're on the losing end of that. You've got all these Straussians who thought that politics is primary, culture is secondary. No, it's not, and you just lost a whole bunch of battles, and you're about to lose an election, more than likely, because you didn't get that.
I've seen a film. It was, I have forgot its name, but it's a film about Latino in the United States and he's very curious because he quotes for Ayn Rand in a lot of ways. It's kind of a Randian multicultural film, and it's quite strange, but I kind of like it. It was very funny. Speaking about talk shows and libertarianism, I always say that my favorite moment on TV was when Ron Paul was in the Tonight Show, and the same day after the interview, he was still sitting with Jay Leno, but Jay Leno introduced the Sex Pistols that were going to play Anarchy in the UK, and Jay Leno said to Ron Paul, and you know something about the song when and I don't know, there are some rumors that Ron Paul is a closet anarchist, but I think that he's fairly more radical than Chomsky, at least, if for people who call themselves anarchists.
Yeah, well, Ron Paul runs in those Rothbardian circles, so I mean, he knows that if he's not himself maybe an anarchist, he knows everyone around him thinks he should be. So that's his peer pressure. that said, and another example just sort of came to mind. I guess it's kind of more explicitly Ayn Rand than libertarian, but Tony Stark and Iron Man, especially that speech he gives to the Senate committee in Iron Man 2, it's a very objectivist Ayn Rand sort of thing. This is my armor. You can't take it. It's my property. It belongs to me, and you can't have it. And meanwhile, I've privatized world peace. It's little things like that sort of crop in, and I've noticed there are lots of people that on the left who would criticize that specifically. They saw it. They saw here's this libertarian message right there in Iron Man. They weren't happy about it at all, and I've had that sort of debate with people coming up into Civil War, which I wrote about.
Yes,
The reason where it seems to me that what the writers are going for in Captain America Civil War is it's sort of Captain America could be seen as the libertarian versus now Tony Stark's not the libertarian. Tony Stark's the establishment. But I tend to take every movie on its own terms, and what I see in that movie is kind of Captain America is sort of like American unilateralism, and Tony Stark's trying to be multilateralism. But there's a lot of interesting politics that go through those Marvel movies from the first Iron Man, which is clearly a movie about blowback. I mean, here's Tony Stark selling weapons, and then he is literally turned into Iron Man because his own weapons are used against him. And in the second movie, he's trying to take control and hold on to them and make sure they aren't used against them. And in the third movie, the third Iron Man movie, he's been involved in all these conflicts, and he's suffering from post-traumatic stress, and he gets more blowback when the Mandarin literally blows up his house. He brings the war to his doorstep. So there's a lot of stuff about foreign policy and blowback and foreign and the like, and terrorism and the war on terror that go through all those movies, all of which I think have some libertarian things, sometimes more explicit than others. But there are also things that libertarians can engage with and do so, I think, fruitfully, and not forcing our way in, trying to force a libertarian interpretation on something when it's not there, like Marxists always trying to force a Marxist interpretation on something, or feminists trying to force a feminist interpretation on something. I mean, sometimes these things are the right interpretation, sometimes they're not, and libertarianism can also be one way of engaging the culture and interpreting it, as long as you just don't go overboard the way everyone else does, typically with the way they interpret things. It's like I always said about Freudianism. Freudianism was a lousy way of interpreting culture until Freudianism became really popular, and then everyone started doing Freudian stuff, and suddenly that became the best way to interpret it. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Well, here in Peru, still Freud is kind of popular, but back into the question about libertarianism, I think that it's curious because I mean here Vargas Llosa was a writer and he tried to run for president. He lost, but it was kind of curious. If he because I know that Cato Institute have written about him, but his politics. Is that because of Rothbard, libertarianism in the United States is very radical, I think. And for example, Graciosa he considers more or less a Friedmanite Hayekian, but he backs, for example, free college. That's not a position many libertarians in the United States, I think, will gonna back. But on the other hand, I was thinking that for example, Borges, I think that some people have described him as a conservative anarchist. And yeah, I know that not necessarily the conservative anarchist or some sort of individual is right for saying it's not necessarily always libertarian, but I guess in some sense could lapse for moments.
Well, I mean, things like libertarianism are they're bound by the cultures in which they grow up, and I've been having some interesting conversations lately about liberalism writ large, and is this something that has an easier time in maritime cultures? Is this why America and the UK have had such a easier time historically with liberalism, classical liberalism, than a lot of other places? And there may be something to that. I mean, maybe if you're in a country like Russia and you're surrounded by all your enemies and they're always constantly invading, you have people tending to embrace strongmen. So maybe there's something to that.
Yeah.
I don't think geography is destiny, but I don't like to discount it.
Yes, that's true. The things that strike me is that I watched this film Alongside Night, and it was, I don't know, I have mixed feelings about it, because I think it was a very powerful story, and on the other hand, I think that they did a pretty lousy job I mean, they cast Kevin Sorbo was
Right.
the guy from Andromeda, if I am not wrong.
Gene Roddenberry's Andromeda. Before that,
Yes.
he was in Hercules, the Legendary Journeys. That's what most Americans probably remember him from, rather than Andromeda. Yeah, well, I haven't seen Alongside Night. I've read the book years ago, and I enjoyed the book. What I saw of the movie, it looked terrible, and
Yes.
that was just a trailer. I don't like to judge based on trailers. As a critic, you shouldn't do that, but life is short as well, and I wasn't going to write a review of it, so I didn't watch it. That said, I did watch and review the first two Atlas Shrugged movies, which suffer from a lot of the same deficiencies as the Alongside Night movie. Budgets that aren't up to the task, maybe actors who aren't up to the task in some cases, although there's some of the actors involved in the Atlas Shrugged movie that I quite like. Samantha Mathis, who was in the second Atlas Shrugged movie playing Dagny Taggart, is one. But those films were, because they were made with such small budgets, they were geared toward a very specific audience, and it's the audience that goes to the movies to see Dinesh D'Souza's Hillary Clinton documentaries. And these are films where I don't know if they're actually using this method, but there used to be a method of booking theaters called four-walling, where studios would come in. These are typically small, low-budget studios. They come in and they just rent the theater. They give the theater the money up front, and then all the ticket sales are theirs. And that was a way particularly small, niche movie studios would get their movies out, particularly back in the 1970s, when we had this long run where it's documentaries about the Bermuda Triangle, or documentaries about the Lincoln assassination, and it would have this conspiracy theory that goes well beyond John Wilkes Booth and the known conspirators, and just these bizarre, odd conspiracy theory movies and they would book the theaters, and that was how they were released. And the way movies like Alongside Night and Atlas Shrugged Parts 1, 2, and 3 were released reminds me a lot of that. It's just, these studios going out, they're picking their theaters and they're putting them out there, and they're gearing them towards this particular audience. And to make sure that audience shows up, they give Sean Hannity, of all people, a cameo in the second Atlas Shrugged movie. And that was when it's like, okay, yes, they didn't make any money off the first movie, so they're getting desperate here for the second one. They think they're going to get Sean to get his audience to show up if he has a cameo in the movie. And yeah, let's just say that's a far cry from what people had hoped Atlas Shrugged would be back when there were all the rumors about how, oh, Angelina Jolie's going to make it and she's going to star in it as Dagny Taggart. And it's like, oh, that's. I'm not sure you can actually make Atlas Shrugged as a movie, really. I think it probably needs to be a 10-episode TV show on a premium cable, and it probably needs to be a period piece actually set in the 1960s, which makes it odd because it's a dystopian future, but you have to set it in the past. It can be done, but you really need somebody that's A, has the resources, and B, has the vision, and getting those two together has been really difficult. And it tends to be difficult with these explicitly libertarian, ideologically driven movies. I think you're probably a lot better off just slipping messages into mainstream movies that are going out anyway. It's how everybody else does it. I mean, if there's a big, huge liberal message movie, it doesn't do well at the box office. It might get up a few awards. If it's Crash, it might win an Oscar, and then everyone really regrets that for the next 10 years. But that's not how it usually works. You slip your messages in seamlessly. They're part of the narrative, and you don't go preaching, which is what Atlas Shrugged does. It's what Alongside Night does. That turns most of your audience away, and it basically means you end up preaching to the converted. I mean, all right, if you've got a captive audience somewhere and you want to show them this, it probably will backfire, but that's about the only way.
Yes, I was thinking in the issue that the Koch brothers could, I think, could spend better their money in investing in films in production. For example, the movies Harsh Mistress that keeps moving on. I think there was initially in 2004 there was a script that was and then they moved it and keep moving the production. I don't know.
The last I heard, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress is, I want to say Tom Hanks is still attached to it. It was renamed Revolution, and again, you take a great title and you turn it into something bland. This is worse than John Carter of Mars being turned into John Carter. Yeah, that's still out there. It's in development hell. I don't know if it's ever going to actually show up. They've been talking about it for as long as I can remember. It's one of these things I'll believe when the cameras are actually rolling. It's like a lot of science fiction movies. It's like Morgan Freeman's going to make Rendezvous with Rama. Yeah, I'll believe that when I see it. There's a lot.
I mean, there is a comic that was called Anarchy, if I'm not wrong.
That was a DC comic from back in the 90s. It was called Anarchy, and I've forgotten who the writer on that was, but it was a very left-wing British kind of anarchy. It wasn't explicitly libertarian, but it was kind of like Alan Moore's V for Vendetta type of anarchy.
But if I'm not wrong, this guy Roderick Long, I think the left libertarian, had written about the parts of anarchy, the first series and then another, and the other was like anarchy was more of a Randian of some sort, but I haven't found it.
Oh, if that's the case, I haven't read that either, but that might have been the period I was out of comics.
It's curious. I think it's quite strange that Deadpool here had success, and it was very strange. I think, well, in Latin America, not all the films that had success in the United States have success. For example, the films about baseball, or here there are very few people that know about baseball. There, but for example, Deadpool was kind of a hit, and some people are saying that now the Xbox is going to become only about this kind of the Xbox, the X-Men is going to become about this kind of character-based universe rather than the big movies.
Well, that's probably for the best for them, because they cannot maintain continuity between movies to save their lives. So better just to throw it out and do character-based movies, and have Deadpool make jokes about the complete lack of continuity between the movies. So are you the young? Sorry, you the young Professor X, or the old Professor X? I forget now. Which one are you working for us?
It could be fun.
But
Oh well, turning to the election, I think that it is very funny because this election is very weird, because in every sense you feel it, even if you are not interested in politics. The thing that is weird. I think you tweeted or write something about that Mr. Skin, for those who don't know, which is the podcast that about nudity in cinema, is talking about Trump. That is kind of weird, I guess.
I don't think I quite heard that. What, could you read that last bit again?
That Mr. Skin, even the guy that has a podcast about nudity in film.
Yeah. Oh, Mr.
He's talking
Skin.
about Trump.
Yeah,
Yes.
I tweeted this. Let me do a little backstory here for everyone who's listening who's not a perv. Mr. Skin's this guy that runs a website. It's basically a celebrity nudity website. But I was listening to his podcast purely for professional reasons, and he got off on talking about something that was election oriented, and it had something to do. Yeah, had to do with after Donald Trump had talked about grabbing crotches, grabbing pussies, as he said it, and I'm like, I can't even listen to a guy talk about the nude scenes in this week's movies and TV shows without the election intruding, which is, it's everywhere. And of course it's in popular culture. Of course it's gotten into the popular entertainment, because Donald Trump has, for the better part of the last decade, been a reality TV host. He's been a reality TV star. And he's been mainly involved in entertainment brand management, meaning himself, the Trump brand, since the 80s. I mean, he had his book, The Art of the Deal, which, okay, that's fine. People do that. That made sense. But then it immediately started getting weird. I mean, really fast. He had Trump the board game. He had Trump steaks. He had all of these weird things that were like infomercial stuff. And it's it's one of these weird things about Trump, is that Trump was not born poor. He was born into money. He got the $1 million loan from his dad, which is such a big point of contention sometimes when he talks about his humble beginnings. But I mean, he's not from the streets. This is not a rags to riches story here. And yet Trump is kind of this stereotypical version of a person who has no idea what to do with money, and then he gets it and he spends it on the tackiest things ever. So you go to his house, you see his house, and he's got these gold gilded everything. He's got 11-foot self-portraits of himself everywhere. It's just tacky. And what it reminds me of is nothing so much as Graceland. I mean, here's Elvis Presley, a guy who did grow up poor in the South. He knew what poverty was. And when he came into more money than he could ever have dreamed of, he builds Graceland, and there's velvet paintings, and there's all of this just tacky stuff everywhere because he doesn't know. And Trump reminds me of that, and his some of his various business ventures remind me of that, and that's to bring it down to a serious level. That's where a lot of opposition to Trump comes from among the Republican elites. I mean, yes, they have policy differences. Yes, he gives them the creeps in some way, but I think there are a lot of people who just think he's tacky, and that was the beginning of why they don't like Trump. They came up with a lot of substantive reasons, and Lord knows Trump gives you a lot of substantive reasons not to like him. But I think that amongst certain class intellectuals, the fact that Trump is this tacky interloper who has 11-foot tall self-portraits of himself and has his wife roaming around with a gold gilded carriage for these awful portraits where it's just like he's flaunting everything without any sense that what he's flaunting is the idea of what a poor person thinks an insanely rich person looks like. That's also been described as part of his appeal. People who don't have a lot of money, who are from particularly the lower middle class, who are attracted to Trump, don't see that as tacky because they don't have a lot of experience with it, and if they do have an experience with it, it's probably from watching Dynasty in the 1980s, which was the tackiest soap opera on primetime television. That was tacky rich people. And especially if you see it in reruns today, it also has that kitsch factor with it, which just highlights it even more. And now I hear they're going to bring it back on the CW, a new reboot of Dynasty, and I'm just like, how can you even do that? It is such a creature of its era. How can it even remotely be the same thing? And Trump's a creature of his era. When he talks about politics, he talks about the Chinese now, but it's the exact same stuff he said about the Japanese in the 80s. When the Japanese were buying up real estate, which of course made him upset. They were competing with him for real estate. But he was this protectionist, nativist. The Japanese are coming in and buying up everything. It's this very much a yellow peril type thing that he employed, talking about the Japanese. Well, of course, then the Japanese economy implodes. They've been in the doldrums for 20 years now, and they've had to sell all the real estate they bought at a loss. So you see the folly of getting worked up about stuff like that. It's those sort of things. Like people are going to come in and buy the land. Well, what are they going to do? Take it back home with them? It's here. It's land. And he makes the exact same arguments now about China, because he's stuck in the 80s. He's stuck in the land of helmet hair, over hairsprayed helmet hair, and large shoulder pads on coats and blouses. That's where he is.
Yeah, I think this election is very weird. Here in
That's an
Latin America,
understatement.
there have been. I mean, in Latin America, there have been quite characters in many, in very different ways. But I think that not only Trump, but the kind of conspiracy theory that appear about Marco Rubio having been a gay prostitute in a park in Florida, or the other story about the father of Ted Cruz being the murder of JFK. It's very strange. I think that I wasn't expecting that. those who despite have their doubts and disagreements with Ron Paul, I would have think that Ron Paul would have made some kind of the establishment. I don't know if he will have win, but without Trump, maybe his message would have been more clearly different than the others. But since he was, I think that Rand was smart enough to not mess around with Trump that much, because he knew part of his base in Kentucky were Trumpites, and he could. But the interesting thing is that Justin Amash, for example, is quite of a never Trump, and
right.
kind of interesting in many ways. I think, well, Justin Amash, one of the few non-white Republicans, he's an Arab, I guess, Arab Lebanese or something like that, and he is someone that I think the left doesn't hate, and I think actually the left likes him more than Ron Paul, because he finally Ron Paul will always be with the issue that the paleo conservatives but Amash in that epoch was a baby probably, so he doesn't carry that legacy.
But Justin Amash does not have a lot of that baggage that Ron Paul unfortunately does have, and he also benefits from the fact that he's in a safe district. He's in a district with a lot of immigrants from the Middle East, and that's going to help him. Help. They tried to primary him with a standard hawkish conservative. Didn't stand a chance. Amash just brushed him aside. But you talk about Ron Paul and you talk about conspiracy theories with Trump, and the thing is, they have overlapping constituencies, and you can see that in the fact that Alex Jones is a fan of both, and both of them have been on Alex Jones's show, and every time Ron Paul was on Alex Jones's show, I would just cringe. But if you talk about the prominence and the prevalence of conspiracy theories in this election, I think it's because you have figures like Alex Jones who have a greater voice now than they ever did before. And that's partly because of the internet. I mean, that's because of the internet, obviously. And some people say, well, yes, it's easier to slap down conspiracy theories than ever before as well, because you can also immediately jump in and criticize them. But you can't deny that not having to criticize something because it's not there in the first place is still easier than having to go in and slap down these rather bizarre paranoid conspiracy theories. And Alex Jones is an interesting figure in this all, because Alex Jones has a direct tie to, and I'm going to blank on his name now, it's the former Nixon aide who is the Trump advisor. Oh, gosh. I'm sorry? I'm sorry?
I think is his name, the guy who lives in Florida.
Well, at any rate, you've got that. Basically, Alex Jones is one person removed from being in Donald Trump's ears, what I'm saying.
Yes.
And so these things can filter their way up, and the next thing you know, it's in a Donald Trump speech, and he's saying, "Oh well, what if Ted Cruz's dad killed JFK?" It's just crazy stuff. But I remember similar things back in the 90s. It's just it was so far outside the mainstream, and it didn't have a way of percolating up.
Like what, for example?
Well, there was this radio host who I think of as sort of the proto Alex Jones, because he's very much like Alex Jones in every way, except that where I think Alex Jones may be doing something of a put on some of the time, this guy back in the 90s was completely sincere. And this guy's name was Chuck Harder, and he ran a radio network out of Florida. And he would have on a lot of the same guests that Alex Jones has on today. Terry Nichols is one, a guy who basically has claimed he was Bill Clinton's bag man, doing all these dirty deeds for Bill Clinton back in the 80s, back in Arkansas. Well, and then he turns on him. Well, Chuck Harder had him on. He had lots of other people. The Clinton death list, which is something that has cropped up again, and the Vince Foster death and all that stuff. That was all stuff that was big in the 90s, and people like Chuck Harder, who had his radio network, and I think he may have had maybe 400 affiliates. He was not a small fry. They were not good affiliates. They were bad radio stations. They were the low-end station in the market, but he had them. I mean, it's kind of like Alex Jones today. I mean, he doesn't have good radio stations, but he's out there. The one thing Chuck Harder didn't have is he didn't have the internet. That wasn't there yet. But he made his money selling stuff on the side. Alex Jones sells herbal supplements and survival gear. Chuck Harder sold American-made pocket watches and survival gear. Alex Jones occasionally talks about UFOs. Chuck Harder talked about UFOs and the paranormal. Alex Jones has ties in to Donald Trump. Chuck Harder had as his guest people who were associated with Ross Perot. So he was working at a lower level, but everything Alex Jones has done and everything that's popped up in the Trump campaign has antecedents in what Chuck Harder did in the 90s and what he was doing with Ross Perot. I mean, Ross Perot's running mate the second time he ran for president was an economist named Pat Choate, who was basically known as the only protectionist economist in the United States. I mean, basically, he was the one economist who's always said free trade is bad. So he was Ross Perot's running mate when he ran the second time in '96. Well, he was a frequent guest on Chuck Harder's radio show back before then, and even guest hosted the show. So I've seen all of this before. It's mushroomed and exploded, and it's stuff that I can't believe has come out from the shadows, is now, if not mainstream, knocking on the door. And which makes me wonder what politics is going to be like once this is all over. Do we go back to can you put this genie back in the bottle, or is it still out there? I mean, the internet's not going anywhere. All these guys, they're not going anywhere. So I mean, Trump's 70-something years. Trump's 70 years old. He can lose and claim he's going to start a TV network. He's going to be dead within the decade anyway. He's 70 years old and he eats Kentucky Fried Chicken all the time. The man's a walking corpse. But I don't think he's created a movement so much as he has mainstreamed something that was there and didn't have a mainstream outlet before. And maybe that's to bring this around to the subject of the podcast, maybe that's what libertarianism needs. Although what the vehicle for that is, I don't know.
I mean, it's quite curious. I think he is a mix of different things. For example, the other guy was a black gay man beating a Trump protester. Was kind of strange. Queer facts for Trump or something was in his T-shirt with a rainbow flag and the Trump name. It was very, very weird. I guess that it's a very strange combination of anti-immigration of gay rights and so.
That's one interesting thing about Trump is he's actually, compared to the typical Republican before this election year, he's actually pretty good on gay rights. It's the one issue where he's not a complete barbarian. And I guess that's just because, you know, he's in New York, he's in a cosmopolitan area. He deals with gays and lesbians all the time, probably, in a way that he doesn't deal with minorities of racial and religious groups. You know, they're off in the other boroughs or something. You know, he doesn't deal with them, but you know, he's probably dealt with enough gay people that it doesn't really bother him. I mean, excuse me, he'll still, you know, make a point about transgendered bathrooms or something because he knows what his base is. But, you know, you don't see him hammering away at gay marriage. I mean, when he talks about protecting the Constitution, he's talking about the Second Amendment. I mean, whether or not you can believe him is another matter entirely. But when he talks about the Constitution, he's talking about the Second Amendment. And yeah, he's talking about bakeries not having to sell to gay couples for wedding cakes. But he's not talking about overturning gay marriage. That's not something you see him hammering away on. That's not an issue for him. It is really weird. It's kind of weird, but then I think that's his background, and he has never had a reason to dislike homosexuals. And that may be the one thing that's different. That's what I see. I don't see it. Maybe, I mean, stuff comes out about him every day. So the next thing, I mean, something could come out tomorrow. Firsthand experience here, but just from what I see, it is notable that is the one group that he's not gone after, and it's also notable that the log cabin Republicans declined to endorse him. the gay Republican group that's been around for decades. He's one group of Republicans that didn't endorse him, and he hasn't even attacked them.
Well,
so, you know,
that's true.
Good for them, I guess.
Yes. Well, the thing I think it's very weird among all the things is that the neo-Nazis fan of Trump, because Trump is in contrary to Pat Buchanan, which I don't think he was a Nazi. I think or neo-Nazi or something. I think that Brian Doherty in a review of the biography that the British guy made, Pat Buchanan, actually, I think it's fair to say that he was a tribalist more than a white supremacist, and actually in the presentation of the book, the author of the biography of Buchanan remember having a conversation with a guy in a New York mall, and when the guy in a New York mall was a Latino, asking about what he was doing in New York, because he listened to his accent, and he was British, so it was to know that he was an American, and he said that he was writing a book about Buchanan, and he told him that his Puerto Rican father had voted for Buchanan, and it was kind of strange, because I think that Buchanan in some way, in some issues, he could sound in some ways even more racist than Trump, but on the other hand, minorities liked him, especially older minorities. I mean, the factory workers and things like that liked it really Buchanan in a way that I don't think necessarily they like Trump, because was, I think, a more consistent critic of the entire Republican Party, and it was very, sometimes I have written about it, but it was, I don't think I have a reply on that article. Other articles I have more. That article, I mentioned that some people try to say that Buchanan is have a very close link to Trump, but the thing that I was thinking is that actually, in his political career, by attempting to challenge Buchanan in the Reform Party nomination, and he knew that he wouldn't win, and it's kind of weird that years have happened and he have won the GOP nomination that Buchanan wasn't able to win. And
well,
things are.
I mean, and it's funny you bring up that Reform Party flirtation of Trump's. I mean, that's where a lot of the stuff that people dig up to say, well, Trump says this now, but he said this just a few years ago. Well, that's when Trump was saying that you couldn't do a lot of these things with immigration and trade that he's proposing now. He was saying, well, you can't necessarily do all that back then when he was thinking of challenging for the Reform Party nomination. And I think he bailed on that because he knew that you couldn't win as a third party candidate, not with that Reform Party and not with the state the Reform Party was in at the time. As far as people that you wouldn't necessarily think supporting Buchanan or even Trump, I think there is a certain feeling out there. People who sense crisis look to strong leaders. I mean, and that's always something that libertarians have to fight against because we're offering the exact opposite. We're saying,
Yes.
actually, the crisis is probably the result of a strong leader. And strong leader is not the solution here. But you run across that, and that's something that's kind of universal. And I don't think Buchanan's a neo-Nazi. I don't think Trump's a neo-Nazi. I think
Yes.
to the extent that to the extent they remind me of anything, though, they do remind me a lot of Mussolini. And I swear,
Yeah.
Trump seems to have watched a lot of newsreel footage of Mussolini because he's got these mannerisms now that are really starting to come through that look like Mussolini doing his bit where he juts out his chin and he folds his arms and the strong man type pose that Mussolini used to do. Trump's got his own version of that now, and it seems to be getting more pronounced the longer the campaign goes on. So I think he's at the very least adopted this sort of strongman thing, and clearly you hear him talk about solving problems. You hear him criticize others about not solving problems. He seems to think that all you need is a strong leader and things will get done, which is, sorry, not how the American system works. It's got branches of government and separation of powers, and gridlock is built in, and it's not a bug, it's a feature of the system. And
Yes, that's
but
true.
but whenever people see problems, and part of it is people are overstating a lot of the problems. Like, people think violence is out of control. Violence is still at near 40-year lows. People think there's a war on cops. Police killings are at near 40-year lows. People think that children are being snatched off the street. Children are safer than... Look, I grew up in the 70s. That was dangerous. This was when it was dangerous to be around. I mean, we had domestic terrorists and all sorts of stuff, and kids were being... statistically speaking, I was a kid in the worst period to be a kid since, the Great Depression.
Yes.
Somehow we got through it.
The clan paranoia is
apart from all of the synthetic fiber that we had to wear, it wasn't that bad. You can get through it. And when you compare that to today, it's just like, everyone really needs to calm down and get a grip. And yes, there's always room for improvement. Yes, there are changes going on in the economy, and there is some creative destruction going out there that is happening pretty rapidly, and it's costing some people their jobs, and it's mostly due to technology and not to trade and not to immigration. It's you've been replaced by a robot or an algorithm, not by Juan down in Tijuana. That's what's happening, and that's causes... It's got more people worried than actually negatively impacted. And they fear, what if I do lose my job? What if I can't pay my mortgage? What if I can't send the kid to college? It's more a mounting pile of what ifs than realities.
yes.
And that's what I think Trump's feeding off of. And when you've got that, it's easy to turn to someone who promises that I'll just go in and fix it. And ironically, I would point to FDR as someone who did that, is like because people really were hurting during the Depression, and there was fear during the Depression as well that that it wasn't going to get better and it might even get worse. And here comes FDR, and he says the only thing you have to fear is fear itself. Except he was totally playing off that in order to get his policies passed. Fear is a constant in politics, and it tends to make people give politicians power that they may wind up later regretting. It's universal, and it's one of those things that it's just libertarians are not at an advantage in dealing with it. We're at the one era in American history where libertarianism really saw a surge was in the 1970s. And that was because both the left and the right had completely failed with their standard talking points in the 1970s. We had inflation, we had unemployment, we had all these things that the consensus said could not happen, yet here they were, they happened, and pretty much everybody across the board realized we've got to do something to turn this around. And that meant that you had, across party lines, people willing to embrace liberalized trade, deregulation, privatization, and the like. Republicans don't like to give Jimmy Carter credit for anything, but it's Jimmy Carter who deregulated trucking, who deregulated the airlines, and who really got deregulation going before Ronald Reagan ever got into office. And arguably, Carter's deregulation over the long term was more profound than what Reagan did.
Yes, that is some point that also have made Jeffrey Tucker, and he said that as you said, many Republicans and even some libertarians don't give him credit. Actually, Ralph Nader also participated in the regulation of airlines, so it was interesting. I think
it was the point where the economy was, and everything was so stagnant, and everything was so everything was just so gridlocked, and Carter kind of had it right. The word was malaise. That was the word he used, and that sort of described everything. And you really needed to shake things up, and that's why people don't realize. Well, people who say, well, we just need Reagan again. Look, Reagan was lowering tax rates when marginal rates were at 80% in that neighborhood. It's not the same thing. What we're talking about now is mostly not quite as sexy. You're talking about some serious regulatory reform, and taxes. Taxes, love them to be lower. Always for that. Never pass up a tax cut. But in terms of the overall macroeconomy, that's not so much the issue right now. I think you're dealing really with regulations that have grown back up again since the deregulatory heyday of the 70s, early 80s, which was really over before Reagan's first term was over.
Yeah, I think that could be true. So now passing to the last topic. What about Alabama? I think it's quite a curious place to be, I guess.
This is Trump country. Trump is going to carry the state easily. It's not going to be close. And what I've seen in a lot of Trump is a lot of what I've seen in George Wallace, who's unfortunately the most famous politician to ever come out of Alabama. And not George Wallace, the segregationist of the 60s, but George Wallace, the presidential candidate. What George Wallace did as a third-party candidate in many ways is what Trump's trying to do now. He's going after blue-collar voters. He's going after disaffected Republicans and Democrats. He's trying to run a campaign from within the Republican Party that George Wallace ran against the Republicans and the Democrats. And you could say, yes, he's going to be more successful than George Wallace did. George Wallace, the first time he ran for president, did carry some states, did win some electoral votes. He's the last third-party candidate to do so, but it still didn't get him the White House, didn't get anywhere close. But now, since Wallace, the demographics of the Republican Party have changed. The Republican Party has gone after those Wallace voters. They have brought them into the Republican Party. They've been largely successful with that. Solid Democratic states in the South are now solidly Republican states, or were. Georgia may flip in this election. That's how bad Trump is. That said, now that Wallace base, as aged as it is now at this point, they had kids who kept the flames going somewhat, and that populist George Wallace base is now in the Republican Party, and for the first time since Wallace ran as a third-party candidate, the Republicans have actually nominated someone who speaks to that base. He doesn't speak to the neoconservative base. He doesn't speak to the libertarian base. He doesn't speak to the religious right, although he has bizarrely gotten the religious right more enthused for him than I could have possibly imagined. But he does speak to those people that were former Democrats who came in and became Republicans in the 80s. And when they say, you know, you've had your shot with your nominees talking to the other factions of the Republican Party, when they say you've had your shot, now it's our turn, that they kind of have a point. They were invited in, they've not had their candidate until now. Now they have their candidate, and come hell or high water, regardless of what happens, they're supporting him till the end, and we'll see what happens on November 8th. I think it's going to be it may be close to the popular vote, closer than people imagine, but the way the electoral map looks right now, it's going to be a wipeout, and Hillary Clinton will probably win the electoral vote pretty easily if things stay as they do right now. But as for Alabama, yeah, Alabama was a Wallace state. It was solidly Democratic. It is now solidly Republican, and Donald Trump is Alabama's type of Republican. It's what Alabama Republicans were promised when they switched from being Democrats, and they finally got their candidate, and here we are. So it's you know. And being a libertarian-minded person in Alabama, it's really kind of weird and kind of frightening, because it's like the complete antithesis. Alabama is not a libertarian state. It has never been friendly to libertarians. Libertarian Party candidates tend to do worse in Alabama than almost anywhere else in the country. I expect Gary Johnson will not have a very good showing here at all. Maybe he'll crack 1%, which he doesn't do when Libertarian Party candidates crack 1%. Libertarian candidates don't crack 1%, but when they get 1%, they don't crack 1% in Alabama. I think Gary Johnson will probably end up getting 5% on election day, 7% if he's lucky, depending on how turnout goes. He's not going to get that in Alabama. It's going to be a Trump landslide. The Democrats in the state have not even bothered to run anyone for statewide office, with the exception of a senatorial candidate who is going to lose in a landslide to Richard Shelby. That's pretty much the state of things down here. Alabama has gone back to being what it was when I was a kid, which is a one-party state. All the action is in the primaries. It's just when I was a kid, all the action was in the Democratic primaries. Now all the action is in the Republican primaries. And the Republicans are now fighting amongst themselves. And we've got all the heads of all three branches of government either having been involved in a scandal or removed from office because of a scandal. Our Speaker of the House is out. He was convicted of ethics violations. He's out. Roy Moore, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, has been suspended for the remainder of his term, and he can't run again because we actually have an age restriction on Supreme Court candidates in this state, and he'll be too old to run again the next time his office is up. So Roy Moore is gone unless he wants to run for governor, and the governor is now involved in an impeachment probe and has had some rather bad stories from his point of view drop just in the past week with so yeah, all the excitement's on the Republican side. They're fighting amongst themselves. They've got all their scandals. The only thing happening amongst the Democrats in this state is one Democratic Party official this week released an open letter saying he was going to step down, and by the way, the other party officials should step down too because they suck. Is basically what happened. And the state Democrats could hold a meeting in a phone booth, and I'm almost not exaggerating. They have deteriorated to that extent.
And they are like Bernie-grats or more Hillary-grats, or I don't know what they are, the Democratic Party there, even if there are few.
Well, the Democrats in this state are still kind of socially conservative. One thing I used to point out to friends of mine from other parts of the country, because several years ago we had a rather egregious bit of legislation passed banning sex toys, you know, dildos and the like. The state legislature banned them. It's ridiculous, and this wound up in the courts and everything. Well, that law was sponsored by a Democrat. This wasn't a Republican law. This was a Democratic-sponsored law passed by the legislature when it was still controlled by the Democrats. That was before the Republicans took over just about everything in the state. So, I mean, some of those Democrats are now Republicans because they can't get elected any other way, so they'll just swap and become Republicans. But that's what you see. You know, that it's the norm nationally. Democrats and Republicans, the first thing they reflect is their district. So conservative Democrats, relatively speaking, come from relatively conservative districts. Liberal Republicans come from relatively liberal districts. Now that's what happens. And so Alabama's Alabama, and the Democrats here are all fairly conservative. And the ones that are liberal, or actually really liberal, you know, there's one down in Birmingham who is an open lesbian, who's a member of the state legislature. She's from a nice liberal upscale district in Birmingham. That's about it.
Well, with that, I think we will end up. It has been great talking to you. Well,
oh, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Over.